Welcome everyone who's just joined us with our very high profile panelists from the architecture and design industry. This is our first webinar of the year at Rise International. We'll be covering inclusive design in Lesotho and internationally. And we have generously been offered their time by our very high profile 4 panelists. I'll start first by introducing them, and we'll then get to the next segment of our program where my co-host, Ndate Ratsepile Ramoko, will then take us through that segment. We'll start first with May Amira. I'm very excited because she's a woman in the built environment and she's empowering those who are young and upcoming like myself. She has over 25 years experience in the architecture and design industry in South Africa, where she's worked across various sectors. She's currently a professor in architecture at the Tshwane University of Technology in Pretoria, South Africa. And she is the SARCHI Chair in Spatial Transformation. She has taught in numerous institutions of higher learning, where she has single-handedly spearheaded the research field of the University of Pretoria and the University of Johannesburg. Her PhD, which she acquired in 2004 in architecture, has provided her a solid foundation in her impressive academic journey. Thank you for being here today, May Amira. Next, we have Dade Ian Goodfellow. He is a principal at Penior and Perced, and the practice's higher education sector lead. He has, for the past 20 years, led a wide range of award-winning higher education projects, which includes a school not limited to architecture, creative industries, and most recently in the Simpson Building for Mathematics and Business School at the University of Kent in the UK. His current projects includes an innovative engineering research facility for the University and College of London, where he's created a new master plan for the Wolfson College of Oxford University. He's also worked in Lesotho before in education projects, and he is extremely qualified, with his highest qualification being an MArch from an institution called RIBA. Thank you for being here, Ndate Ian. Next, we have our very own from Lesotho, Ndate Mpeti Morojele. He is the owner and founder of the world-renowned MMA Design Studio, which is an award-winning architecture and urban design studio that is based in Johannesburg, South Africa. For the last 25 years, MMA has been involved both in architectural and urban projects in various countries on the African continent and internationally. Through his love and passion for design practice and writings, he has emerged as an important voice in the architecture industry in Africa. He's celebrated both by the Arc Daily and the New York Times as one of the most influential groups of architects whose work will define the architectural character identities of rising Africa. His most recent project that impacted here in Lesotho was participating in the Maseru 2050 Urban Planning Project. Welcome, Tate Peti. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Welcome.
Last but not least, we have our own local Datera Moshabu Dikhotle. He is a passionate architect with over 15 years experience practicing in Lesotho, in his own practice, both as an educational facilitator. He holds a master's degree from architecture from the Savannah College of Art and Design in the US. And currently he works as the head of architecture at Limpopo University of Creative Technology, where since his enrollment in the role in 2012, has been able to groom and change the face and quality of architecture in Lesotho as we know it. Now that we have met a very impressive panel of panelists who are going to discuss inclusive design in Lesotho and internationally, I'd like to pass over to my co-host, Ndate Ratsepile Ramoko, to take us through to the next segment.
Thank you very much, Ree. Also, just to introduce myself, my name is Ratsepile Ramoko. I'm a design and media assistant here at Rise, and I'm very passionate about architecture. I'm a young designer as well myself, so it's a great honor to meet all of you, Ian, Dadampeti, Amira, Dadara Mushabudi. It's a great honor. So we're just gonna jump straight into it and start with the presentations. Our panelists will be quickly going into detail about what inclusive design is. So I don't know, Ian or Amira, which one of you would like to go first?
Would you like to go first?
I'm happy to do so.
Awesome, great. The floor is yours, and you may share your screen. Thank you very much.
I hope that everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. Rise Webinar Series, 27th January, yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for this invitation. I immediately see a typo. Forgive any typos you see in this presentation. So we've been invited to speak about inclusive design in Lesotho and internationally. I have a very special personal link to Lesotho, and I worked there for a year. My husband worked there for 4 years. I know Lesotho well, but I don't know it now for many years. So I'll be focusing on my ideas on inclusive design in general, with a focus on South Africa, where I reside and work. I've been asked to address a few questions, looking at international experience, looking at why inclusive design is important, what it is, inclusivity related to safety, whose responsibility is it to deliver more inclusive design, and what's the role of government. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, start off with the most important things that I want to say, and then I'll jump into the questions. So what I would like to focus on today is that many important things in design are seen as niche. So this person specializes in this or that. And my argument is that this needs to become mainstream practice and not a niche area where a few people specialize. It should just become the way that we do design, and the way that we teach design, and the way that our environments are delivered. So my argument is that designing for access and inclusion should be done by everyone. And I make the comparison here, designing for sustainability. We've gotten into the habit of saying this is a green architect or a green architectural practice. Everyone should be green. Everyone should be designing for inclusion. And another thing that I often like to emphasize is the food production as an integral part of our cities and our urban interventions. I just think it just needs to become mainstream practice. And I think the fact that these are niche are our biggest fallacies. I think they are simply good design policies. Some things are already incorporated into policy and regulations, and other things are just left to the personal whims of decision makers and passionate individuals and champions. And I don't think that's good enough. And I'm referring here, and I acknowledge my friend and colleague Amanda Gibbert, who works at the Department of Transport, who many years ago introduced me to this idea of the legal requirements versus the moral requirements. So while there's a lot of things in policy, there's also moral obligations, and how do we balance that? So we need to get the policy right, but we also need to be alert to our moral obligations. So I hope my slides will move. Sorry. Okay. Sorry for that. So a lot of South African or African cities like to present themselves as world-class, progressive, modern, and the new buzzword smart. And a lot of times those are translated into very specific imagery, leaving many communities excluded, disadvantaged, silenced, and hidden. And you'll see that my presentation many years ago, Amanda and I wrote quite an extensive paper looking at housing and housing policy and how housing subsidies are used in relation to access issues. So we have studied that quite a bit. But for this presentation, I'm really focusing at city level, inclusion at city level. So there's a lot of problems to these buzzwords. This is an image of Dubai, and one looks at, it's almost like we've gotten into the habit of admiring cities from a bird's eye view and not really acknowledging the struggles of everyone in navigating those cities. This is also an aerial view of Warwick Junction in Durban. Same issue arises. And there's a little bit of a time lag when I share. And this is my home town of Khartoum, where the Blue and the White Niles meet. And you'll see that we have a lot of riverfronts, and those riverfronts offer a lot of opportunities, and they're always disputed spaces between big capital and small scale business owners trying to make a living. So at city level, at infrastructure level, at built environment level, we build elements that last a long time, they're expensive, and many institutions take part in it, but there's very little idea of how we can really harness the potential of those to the benefit of everyone. And I think there's a very big knowledge deficit in this area. So, for example, this is a tea lady. I often use this image. There are hundreds of them that operate on the River Nile in Khartoum, along those many river edges that we have. And the one on the right is from Kigali, a very simple mode of transport with the shimmering Kigali skyline at the back. And in 2016, protests erupted in Sudan, which just demonstrated how people started understanding that they really needed access to opportunity along those river Niles and other areas in Khartoum. So people became very alert to those disabilities. So that's just some of the issues that I'm concerned with internationally and in Africa. So inclusive design, and why is it important? So when Amanda Gibbert and myself wrote our paper in 2007, we quoted, and it's an unknown author, "Disabled people aren't like everyone else, they are everyone else." I'm very alert to the change in terminology since then. So we used to refer to disabled people. We now refer to people with disabilities. So I just want to say that this was written some time ago, and our own thinking evolves as we go along with this. But what we argued in our paper is that users of the built environment are not just people who are physically disabled or people with disabilities, with sensory disabilities, hearing, sight, learning disabilities, mental illnesses, elderly people, young children, people with heavy luggage, people with dexterity problems, neurological problems, women who are very pregnant, people in a hurry and not looking where they are going, people who are temporarily disabled, people who forgot their glasses on the day, people who are distracted. All of us need an inclusive environment. And if we don't cater for all of us, we generate a form of architectural apartheid. And I've put the link there for those who want to go back and look at that. I think it's quite an old paper, but I think it's quite useful. So what we argued in that paper is that at the time, the population of South Africa was at about 44.5 million. And then we looked at the disabled people in the population, HIV positive, remembering that now HIV is more of a chronic disease with good medications, but at the time it was a very real problem. And children under 6 years old, the elderly, and then a total of 19.8 people that needed special attention in the design of our environments. And we argued that this is almost half of the population at the time. So I just went back to look at some of the current figures because I was curious to see, have things like dramatically changed in terms of percentages? So I looked at some of the more recent statistics, and I think our argument still holds so many years after we wrote that paper in terms of the elderly and the young and the disabled and the HIV positive people. So, and these are just some of the more recent statistics. You can see there that graph of prevalence of HIV positive, and the previous one was the elderly and the youth. So in South Africa, and my interest, for those that know me well, is always housing and informality and city policy and city planning. So the reality is we have very advanced policies, If we read the policies, they really make sense. But then when it comes to actual implementation and monitoring, we really fall or fail dismally. So I think that is where I will end. And if there's opportunities, I will participate more a bit later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Amira. Back to my co-host, Dr. Tepile, can you take us through to the next presentation from one of our very illustrious panelists?
Thank you very much. We'll have a segment for questions. So to all the audience and people watching on Zoom and on Facebook, please do start writing your questions so we can have that segment. Over to you, Dr. Ian, with your presentation.
Thank you. Just one moment while I find it. Right, hopefully you can see that. Is that visible?
Not yet, not on my side. Yes.
Yeah, and can you just see the slides?
We see it in PowerPoint format, so it's not on present yet. Yeah.
Ah, yes. Hopefully you can see that now. Okay, great. Amira, I think that was a wonderful introduction, and that was the kind of expansive overview that I was hoping you were going to give, because I'm really focusing much more, as I've been asked to really present.
Yeah, and we still see 2 slides. We see your next slide as well.
Oh, I see.
So it's not on.
Oh, apologies. For some reason, it's showing that right here. I'll just try that again then. One moment.
Okay.
Try that. How's that?
Yes.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Right, great. Yes, so I was saying, Amira, that was a wonderful introduction, and I think the kind of expansive overview that this whole conversation needs, because it's I couldn't agree more. It's not just about where people can take wheelchairs and drop curbs. It's actually about a much wider concept of inclusivity, which I think for many of us actually is really something that relates really to the idea of the broadest inclusion. And I think your point that actually it really involves most of us. It really is about all of us, rather than just the very particulars of one condition or another. So I think you know, I think it really, in the UK, the perception of inclusive design has maybe moved on quite a lot from these initial documents. and the idea that really enshrined within building regulations are lots of things relating to access to public buildings, ways of moving around, exact dimensions for toilet facilities, the perception that we need to be accommodating a very wide diversity here. CABE on the right-hand side produced this very good book about 15 years ago now, and it actually holds pretty well to date and is still used as a reference document. I think that really, you know, at the heart of inclusive design, it's really places that it's really that thing of making sure that you're designing for everybody at the beginning, and it shouldn't be an imposition to consider that wider the wider concept of inclusivity. We've got to acknowledge diversity and difference, and that's
sorry to interrupt you, Ian. We seem to be seeing your emails. I don't know if.
Oh, why didn't you? Sorry, you should have said something. Have you been looking at that for a long time?
Yeah, quite some time. I thought, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. God, give me a break. Right. Right, one moment, and I'll come back to you here. All right. So, sorry, give me 1 second. Right. Sorry, I'm used to Teams, so.
That's okay. In the meantime, while you're working on your presentation, we'd like to invite the audience to ask any questions that they have on Amira's presentation or yours so far. And in the chat box, so we can read them out and have a discussion on them. I have a question, Amira, for you. This is one based on your presentation. What do you feel like has been the most transition you've seen in spatial transformation thus far in Africa?
That's a very tricky question because I need to be speaking about positive things, I guess. I have very little positive experiences to share. And that's why I very much consider myself an activist in that sense, because I believe and I did have some things that I wanted to share regarding government's role in this process, because I believe government needs to be funding innovation, and I don't think we have enough of that. So it relates to how funding is used in the built environment, but the way that we are using, the way we're funding the built environment and the way we're delivering the built environment currently just creates the same of what we have. There's pockets of excellence here and there, but I don't think that's good enough. I think we need to completely rethink the way that we deliver the built environment. So government has to facilitate that process. So yes, there's you see evidence like accessible toilets and a curb there and so on. But if the whole city is structured incorrectly, people are disadvantaged. And if you have a disabled or a person with a disability living in that disabling environment, they are twice disadvantaged. So I see Ian's slides are on. So I think I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Amira, thank you for that very thorough explanation. Over to you, Ian, which also gets into the question of what is inclusive design and why does it matter?
That's great. Apologies for before. Yeah, so I think that conversation that Amira has mentioned, that move from it just being considered physical to mental to taking on all qualities of neurodiversity, and that consideration of all the different issues. I loved your reference to someone who's even forgotten their glasses. We should all be able to navigate our environments, and we should be designing those environments to make sure that we're all included. So I think it's really quite simple, but it's strange how the processes by which it takes a society to get to that point. In the UK, we've, you know, the design of buildings is very interesting that we've actually been going back to now revisit some of our buildings and finding ways that we can, sorry, I'm just getting back to moving on to the next slide. Excuse me. Ah, yes, here we go. Can you see that? No.
No, it's
here
just.
yes, here we are.
Yes,
That's it. Thank you.
Now we do.
So yes, so we've actually now been revisiting lots of these big public buildings where you can see to the right the main steps up, and actually, and then to the left there's a brand new entrance there. That's actually now the main entrance. The entrance at the top of the steps is no longer used because it was recognized that people can't be using. Not everyone can use that, and therefore it's you know, it's quite clearly discriminating against a whole portion of society. And I think this is wonderful. This is really recognizing how we should be redesigning our cities. This is one example of a classical building designed 19th century. But that's now the design principles that we're applying to designing all our new buildings. As a practicing architect, we've been involved with design of schools, university buildings. In fact, I feel close to Lesotho because I spent 2008 there, involved in the design of some special education needs schools in Lesotho. So I am aware of the distance to go with a city like Maseru and the infrastructural issues and all kinds of urban design. So I think it's good to look, we certainly look to the rest of the world to see where these kind of principles are benefiting and where we can learn more from others. For example, Scandinavia is incredibly advanced in this area. One of our most recent projects is one which is actually for University College London, for a professor who's studying how people interact with their environments. So this has been a very interesting journey for us, working with him to design this special laboratory, which you can see it's called the Person Environment Activity Research Laboratory. And in there he simulates the real world in various experiments with people with various well, it's really a cross-section of society. He'll carry out an experiment, for example, where he will be with the design of new tube trains. They'll be exploring how people access these, how quickly people get on and off, what happens if a bomb goes off, or if there's a fire. Any of these things, to see how quickly people can evacuate and how to make sure it's safe for people with whole wide range of neurodiverse profiles. So he's the master of collaboration. So he's collaborating with neurologists, with physicists, with sound specialists to try and redesign everything, including our oral world. And currently, he's actually been tasked to give sounds to electric scooters. So suddenly, I don't know if it's happened in Southern Africa, but certainly in the UK, there's a proliferation of electric scooters has appeared in the last year, but they have no sound, and they can whiz up behind you if you're a pedestrian, and you don't hear them as you're stepping off the pavement. So it's what kind of sound might that be? And he's looking to to understand better how we should be designing our cities from the point of view of our oral field. In a way, our ears are are not acclimatized to city design. So it causes us a lot of stress. We can't work out where sounds come from. And in fact, he points out that an ambulance, the sound that an ambulance has been given is to let you know that the ambulance is there, but it doesn't let you know where. It's somewhere. That's why people stop and look around desperately. And we need to be designing everything, not just surfaces and buildings, but also our whole designing for all of our senses. So I think that this project's been incredibly interesting. And so we've taken that in the design of the building as well. So as you approach it, easy wayfinding, making sure that it's tactile, that people with any kind of disability can arrive here. He'll be doing experiments with people with autism, with Alzheimer's, how they wayfind, how they arrive at buildings, and then also how they actually move through a whole series of his experiments. So in the welcome space to the right, on the desk, there's a braille map of the building. There's all kinds of ways to assist people using this. And I think in conclusion for this part, we'll come back to questions. I think it's really the health and wellness agenda is now one that we need to expand to. It shouldn't just be about inclusion. It's the inclusion conversation goes further to actually what are the kind of environments that make us healthy and make us feel well. And that's really the essential crossover to sustainability, where we need to be designing with the knowledge of the need for climate adaptation. We are going to have some temperature increases, and I think Lesotho today is experiencing some strange weather, and we need to be taking all of these things as positively as we can and reshaping our urban environments for the future. So thank you. I'll return questions and I'll hand back to Gretse for the further chairing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ian, for that very elaborate presentation. Dr. Petty, over to you. Dr. Tsepile will share your presentation on your behalf.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome to all the participants. I'm a fan of RISE, so I'm always interested in the work that they're doing, and particularly because it's work that's done in a location that I am quite familiar with. So I will just quickly talk about my understanding of the idea of inclusive design. Firstly, to say that, like the previous speakers before, we understand inclusivity to not be limited purely to the physical. I think immediately, although it's a very important topic, we need to understand who is disabled, what type of disabilities, as Amira so correctly put out, and what other type of identities enable and disable people in our cities. I give you one example. We had a workshop where there was a lady living with albinism, who said the way she navigates the city is through shadow, because the sun is harsh on their skins. The sun is actually an enemy, and that when she moves through the city, she has to move from shadow to shadow, or she must move on the side where there's shadow. So I would never in my wildest dreams have imagined that this is a way to navigate a city. But people who are differently configured have different ways in which they navigate our cities, whether you're male, whether you're female, etc. So I think empathy is a very important component of inclusive design, being able to understand or get into the shoes of other people. So this first slide, really, there's 5 items of inclusivity I'll take you through quickly. The first one is the obvious one about physical access. You can see on the left there, that's a slide of a typical pavement in Maseru. This is some of the survey we did as part of the the Maseru 2050 plan. And you can imagine that we spend a lot of money and worry about potholes and surfaces for roads and cars, but not so much for people. And imagine trying to navigate those pavements being otherwise abled, whether you're blind or whether you're limping or you're moving in a wheelchair. And we don't spend enough talking about simple things like surfaces of pavements and how they can help not only the disabled but also the abled when it's raining or when you're having to walk in the mud, and particularly in a town like Maseru, which is a walkable city, we should actually be prioritizing the pedestrian. Can I have the next one, please? Can I have your next slide? So yeah, the question of access and mobility, which has to do with transport, how we use public transport, how that discriminates against people becomes an important factor. Then I talk about economic inclusion, the ability to be part of the economy, whether you're in the formal or the informal sector. Inclusivity becomes, after almost being physically able to access the city, but economically to be able to participate in the city, means that our planners need to start looking at how we accept the informal sector into our cities and actually design for it, because it's not like one day they will disappear. But this is how our cities have to start accommodating. Can I have the next one, please? When we talk about social inclusion, being able to access social amenities, starting from the neighborhood level, your houses, the housing agglomeration of houses, safe neighborhoods, to inclusivity with places for recreation, places for children in particular can be a problem in some cities, medical health, welfare, etc. So social inclusion, by definition, is an extension of the economic inclusion. That, again, is an extension of the physical. Next one, please. You can see some of these images are from the RISE competition for housing in Maseru. Cultural inclusion, again, once we were doing studies on the Maseru plan, we find that there's a lack of public space for kind of cultural expression. And where there is public space, these spaces tend to be locked with a gate and key, and they're not accessible. Whether it's this park that you're seeing here or the other Central Park or the Friendship Park, all the parks seem to somehow be locked and not made inclusive. And therefore, sometimes to have that space of cultural inclusion becomes difficult and not designed into our city. Next one, please. And then finally, inclusivity, more and more important now, is biodiversity and what's known as nature positive design. In other words, when we build and plan our cities, it's not that you clear the earth in order to create built environment, but that you work with and include the natural environment as part of our built environment, if you like. Both the green assets that we have, which are your green areas, as well as your blue assets, which are your water bodies, and to turn them around to look at them as positive aspects of inclusivity, where we can create, use the green for growing food. I think Amira mentioned that as well. Or recreation becomes an important part of leading an inclusive life. And similarly with the water bodies, you can see the dam on the right in Maseru, which has not been used to its full potential. It's almost seen as a negative thing that people dump stuff into, and it's a barrier to movement, etc. So just as a kickoff, I think as a kind of a broadening of the idea of inclusion and the totality of the human experience in the city, It's really to say, apart from including people who may struggle because of living with a particular disability, but there are other people who will also struggle because of an economic inability or a social or cultural exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ndate and Petty, for that very insightful navigation system of the 5 points of how to navigate a city. Last but not least, we'll get to Ndate Kgotle to take us through his take on inclusive design in Lesotho.
All right, thank you very much, Mayor. I'll just be brief since I'm not, exactly giving a presentation. But I think looking even into the presentations we've already had from the other guests, one of the things that strikes me as fairly important is the fact that as we try to make or create inclusion, it's important that we don't end up having that inclusion with strong distinction. So for instance, some people shouldn't be made to feel like while they are able to access the same building, they're limited to which floors they're able to access, or that they have to go in through the back versus the majority of people using the front entrance. So how we create those kinds of areas in buildings and cities is quite important. In the educational field, I think relating to Mira's presentation, we are looking at the moral impetus of inclusive design. So it's trying to impart to people learning in architecture and in urban design that this isn't just something that you do as a special favor, but that we have a responsibility to create environments that everyone feels at home in. And just as an example, as I close off there, I'm thinking about a situation I had a personal experience with. It doesn't have to do with physical ability, but as a father of 2 young daughters, I've had an incident where I had to compare my visit to a shopping center in Bloemfontein, where I was able to take both of my little girls to the restroom. And we were able to use a family restroom where I, as a male, was able to enter with the 2 of them, and they're able to use that facility. And here at home in Lesotho, we have a mall that was developed much more recently than the shopping center there in Bloemfontein. But as I had to use the restroom, I'm now having to see them off at the door so that they can use the ladies' room, which I wouldn't be welcome into for obvious reasons. And I think another issue that's going to become important in this discussion of inclusive design is the new, well, not new, but new to our understanding, perhaps, is, gender identities. So how are people who have gender identities that are different from what we've grown up with, male and female, able to navigate certain spaces? So I appreciate that it is a very broad discussion, even though we might have started it off thinking about people with different abilities physically more than anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ndate Kgotle. Ndate Retz, do you want to take us through the questions in the audience, in the chat box?
Yes. I just wanted to, appreciate when Ndate Kgotle just said that inclusivity is not some special favor, which ties in well with what all the panelists have been speaking about in terms of, like Ian talked about, just a health and wellness agenda. So it's really broadening the spectrum of what inclusivity is. And so we have a question in the chat box from Ndate James, which is going to Ndate Mpeti, which says, what role do you think technology can play to bridge the gap in cities where physical infrastructure is neglected?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, it talks to a lot of innovation that's happening both internationally and locally. Recently, I heard about an app that was being developed by, I think it was Arab engineers in London, where your app, because people use bicycles to ride around the city, and you don't want to be in a place where there's a lot of smog. So that app would actually map out, like Waze does, routes that have less pollution on a particular day at a particular time. So you could choose your route on a bicycle depending on where the pollution is less. So in a way, this is an innovation that allows people to use bicycles in the city and avoid the pollution that comes with riding in smog. So I think if we were to translate that to maybe a local context, maybe there could be apps developed with maps that show people on wheelchairs a kind of a route that they can follow, which is easily you can navigate, for example. So if there's where there are ramps and where it's easy to travel, one could develop kind of a mapping system, maybe linking it to GIS or whatever, that could aid people with different abilities, whether it's blindness or physical disability. Of course, the e-hailing thing, the local equivalent with the moonlight taxis could be put onto an app, for example. So I think, yeah, it's about innovation and translating innovation to a local context. You know, we use the money system of M-Pesa, where you can send each other money and trade money and goods without actual cash, which is a local Southern African invention that suits our local situation. So I think a lot of innovation, digital innovation, could help with various aspects of city living and access.
Thank you very much for that answer about technology and the role of innovation, which comes to the question of, you know, who then is responsible for kind of developing these kind of apps, the roles of the people providing this accessibility. So then I would like to, you know, pose this question towards Amira about what role do architects, the governments, and even app developers, user UX, UI design play in developing safer city and better cities for people living with disabilities?
Thank you so much. At the risk of being very pessimistic, we can have accessible buildings, we can have accessible toilets. We know how to do it. We've been trained how to do it. We can have accessible transport nodes, a really great bus system that allows you to access the buses or the trains very easily. But if the city structure doesn't allow you to get to those facilities, what's the point? If the city structure denies you job opportunities, if you're a person without disabilities, the city structure can disable you. And if you're a person with disabilities, city structures can make it even worse. And we have that situation. I wish that my colleague from the Department of Transport was here to share about the controversies around the BRT system, as an example, in South Africa, where things work, but then, you know, sometimes you can't even cross the road to get to the bus station. So that's just something I'd like to raise. I also want to make a comment that spaces also need to adapt to changing and dynamic life circumstances of individuals and families. So that's something that needs to be factored in. And some of those changing life circumstances are people becoming older or becoming disabled. And then just also perhaps another provocation as a response to the technology question from James and Peter's response around apps showing people in wheelchairs how to navigate certain spaces. Is that not a form? And I do not claim to have answers. I'm just throwing it in as a provocation. Is that not a form of architectural apartheid? I mean, I should go in my wheelchair and access the same routes that everyone else accesses, have the same experience, and not have to go through some side, access point that is just for someone with a wheelchair. So do we not need some deeper thinking with regards to what architectural apartheid really is? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Perhaps Betty, would you like to add something before I read the comment in the chat box?
Yeah, I think Amira's right that in an ideal world, we would want to get rid of all these barriers. I think some of these are just contingent means to arrive at the future that we would like. I know, for example, that there is another app again that allows women who feel not safe when they're walking at night to call into a particular place that they kind of talk them through getting to a place of safety. And that seems to help at one level. Of course, it's not ideal. We shouldn't be having these problems. So I think, yeah, it's a contingent measure, but it's not ideal.
Okay, thank you, Tate Mojele. We have a comment from Tate Sifuti who says he thinks inclusive and urban design starts with participatory design, which persons living with disabilities can be able to participate in the planning and outline of how existing barriers can be removed. And that we should not believe that we can build inclusive urban cities without the participation of persons with disabilities. And that really brings me to the question directed to you, Ian, on the coordination and the regulation to harness the strength of private sector and other developments, even in the government. How can architects and construction companies be really involved in making sure that they include people living with disabilities when designing towns, when designing cities at any scale, a pedestrian scale, at accessing all floors of a building? How would they do it?
Right, thanks. Well, it's obviously it takes a lot, and it takes a lot of people to solve a lot of these problems or to create things. And I think that is probably something which has been very spiriting in the last few years. Is there's much more of a conversation, certainly in the UK, about a kind of co-design, about inclusive design, about co-creating, and certainly as an architectural practice, we don't really talk about stakeholder engagement and stakeholder workshops. We talk about co-creation workshops. So we very much like to work with our clients and all the potential users of the building in a way that is, we're the designers, but everybody is part of the solution. And in fact, 25 years ago, we did a housing guidance document that was then published by the government called Accommodating Diversity, where we spoke to a wide range of different of people from different ethnic backgrounds about their ways of living, to make sure that any housing standards that are set are able to include that wide diversity of people that, particularly in London, live in many different ways. Otherwise, you get architects designing for essentially one cultural mindset, and then people have to try and adapt either the houses that they, if the social housing that they're given by the state, they have to either adapt those physically or have to adapt their own behavior within those spaces. So we're very much shaped by our environments. And that thing of the collective endeavor is essential. But I don't think we can ever get away from the fact that government has a significant part to play in terms of the actual building regulations that are set. Because for a long time, I've been working with developers on all kinds of things. And the biggest incentive to do something is if it's effectively enshrined in law and they have to do it. Otherwise, when it comes to saving money, all of these nice to haves start to disappear, and they just push for well, it's what everybody does. How can we be expected to pay for this or that? I think it's much clearer conversation if the regulation is in place. And I think that's the great strength of the whole construction industry, consultants, everyone who wants to see that outcome, that better outcome, to also lobby government to make sure it's enshrined. How else do we get developers to do these kind of initiatives? I think where you do find enlightened developers, then there's a great opportunity to collectively work on a visionary project that then resets the agenda. And there's some fabulous examples of that, whether it's in urban design. The mayor of Copenhagen, I don't know if you've followed what's happened in Copenhagen over the last 20 years, but it's been heavily pedestrianized. And that's had an amazing transformation on the city. And there's so much more use by the pedestrians, by everyone using the cities of those urban spaces right through the winter months. In fact, cafes hand out blankets, people sit outside. It's enjoyed. We should be enjoying our public space. And actually, I think since the invention of the motor car, many of us have just been tolerating our public space. We've had 100 years to get cities designed with motor cars, and we've not done a great job of it. So I think moving forward, there's lots of opportunities. I think I'll stop there. There's lots to say, but hopefully that's captured something of a response.
Yeah, you did. I think capture the response, and you mentioned about a cultural mindset that needs to be transformed from within people involved in the industry. To which then I would like to. We have run out of time. The 1 hour runs out pretty quickly. So last question, which is posed to all of you, is having discussed all these things, from reshaping it from legal requirements or like regulations to now having to look at them as moral obligations or moral requirements in Lesotho, what would you say is preventing the implementation of policies so that these can start becoming a reality for people living with disabilities and such? Perhaps maybe in Dr. Khotle, you may start.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramok. In Lesotho, I think the biggest problem that we have is, first of all, that there is a lack of appreciation for what inclusivity means, not just for the people who are left behind by the kind of environment that we're creating, but what we are also missing by having a good segment of our population being excluded from school buildings, excluded from healthcare facilities, but also excluded from being able to make their input economically by showing up in the same spaces at work that we are able to. And with the little laws that we do have, I think we need to create a bigger capacity for enforcement, because there are little areas where you find that there are things that were set out in plans and that were supposed to take place when a building was developed or a certain part of a project was being undertaken. Without knowing the finer details of it, I think looking at the infrastructure, I'm quite amazed that we have a new development of traffic lights in the city. And I haven't seen that some simple technologies that allow people with certain impairments to be able to cross the street, sounds coming from traffic lights, some tactile devices to let them know what's going on the road, haven't been considered in a project that, you know, was unfolding in 2021. So those are some of the things that I think are kind of challenging us here in Lesotho.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Khotle, for that very insightful aspect of here back home. Before we close off, I'd like to give an opportunity to all the panelists to just give us a key takeaway of what do you think, in your expert opinion, needs to be done for us here as Lesotho to learn from other towns and cities really that have mastered the art of designing inclusively for people with disabilities? What can we learn for us to start implementing here in our present day reality? I'll start first with ladies first, Mayor Amira.
Thank you so much. There is a question for me in the chat around what are the main causes that prevent implementation of policies in South Africa and Lesotho. I think it's a lack of imagination and political will. I think governments need to demonstrate through pilot projects what is possible, through partnerships. Visualization and representation tools are important, but even more important are real life projects. And government needs to be the facilitator of that. And these pilot projects then encourage replication, and there are finance management tools and design tools to achieve this. So that is something that I would like to say. And then just a response to Mahau, Klabe, and students. Looks like a big group. Around autism, I would like to direct them to the work of Majda Mustafa in Cairo, Egypt. She is the real expert around autism and the built environment, does a lot of work for various agencies. So Mahau, please do look up Majda Mustafa, and I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mayor Amira. Dr. Ian, the same question I asked. What do you think we as Lesotho can learn from cities and towns that have mastered the art of planning inclusively for people with disabilities? What can we do to learn and start implementing it here?
Well, I think Amira covered that quite well in terms of a point I had about exemplars. So the pilot projects, if you can actually show yourselves what's possible in your own towns and cities, then that's a positive cycle, and everybody then actually starts to demand it. You know, it's actually about what people in this society actually think is appropriate for their own environment, and then that hopefully builds up a pressure that will then start to manifest itself through the political institutions, etc. In a process where people powered change, I think is really one of the biggest things. And I think we see that through a lot of this conversation about diversity. You can look back over the last 40 years and see key moments where demands have been made. So I think demand better, and also invite. I think Lesotho is a wonderful place, absolutely beautiful country. Maseru's got the potential to be a fabulous city, and to be able to invite people from other cities, mayors, etc., who are doing really interesting things. They'll get the fabulous opportunity to visit Lesotho, and then they can actually, the importance of a mayor arriving will then and having a conversation at a political level will then be an inspiration for others as well. So it's sort of carrot and stick, I think. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Ian. Dr. Mpeti, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to what Amira was saying about the structure of a city and how it can either enable or disable. Because I think, Maseru, one of the biggest things that disable us is the density or lack of density. You can imagine if already Maseru town is a walkable city, but nobody lives there. Every night you have to get into some form of transport and travel 5-10 kilometers out. But imagine if we had the kind of density that would allow people to live within the city. Then immediately you have to deal with proper pavements. You have to deal with transportation. You have to deal with people socializing in the urban spaces. You have to deal with allowing people to live, work, play, and access all parts of the city. So my biggest takeaway is the structure of Maseru and the lack of density, because that, you know, even economically, we don't have a lot of economic activity because of that lack of density. So I would encourage everybody who's listening and who's participating to really try and understand this issue of the structure, the density, and also the topography, because I mean, Maseru's got a unique topography, which makes it difficult to plan as other cities plan. But there are examples of how you work around the topography in planning. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mpeti. Dr. Hote, do you want to close us off? Not for the discussion, but for the let May Amira close us off with a few last words.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. I think an important thing is just what we are doing here is creating discussions around all of these things. So whether it's a discussion when a project is unfolding, or a wider discussion where we can look at our city and have people from different areas of life make inputs about what they see as a need. That's going to take us one good part of the way in resolving these issues. I think where there was something touched on technology, I believe nothing has been as friendly to us in the built environment as the advent of the technology that we're using now. The fact that whether it's with my students or my clients, there are examples of things that we don't have locally here that we're quickly able to bring to the table. They become much more valuable to them in deciding where they want to go when they're able to see the examples of how other cities are tackling their infrastructure and their buildings. So that is where I'd like to go. I think I'm thinking like an educator. Let's get talking and let's reveal to people what's out there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Hotle. May Amira, over to you for our last words for the discussion today.
Okay, I thought I was done, but thank you so much for the opportunity. I always have something to say. So I think, Mpeti says that he really believes in RISE in this organization. And if you could help facilitate those partnerships whereby experimentation and implementation can happen, that would be incredible. And I put in the chat there that Lesotho needs to become a pioneer. And, why not? We really have to think in those ways, and we have to think it's really good to look out there in the world and see what examples there are, but we have our own very unique problems in the region and in Africa. And I think we can become pioneers if we are really if we focus on experimentation, innovation, and partnerships towards achieving that. Those would be my final comments. Thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you very much, Mia Amira. Ironically, pioneers is what we call our fellows who've gone through the 10-month design and building fellowship. They're called pioneers once they've gone through it. For those who've just joined us, you have just missed a very, very insightful conversation on inclusive design in Lesotho and internationally. We were joined by our very 4 generous and highly skilled panelists. We had Dr. Ian Goodfellow from the UK, Dr. Mpeti Morojele, who's the designer and lead of MMA Studio, Amira Osman, who's got over 25 years experience in academia, who's in South Africa at TUT currently. And lastly, we had Dr. Khotle, who is head of architecture in the built environment at Lim Queen. So we are Rise International. We are a not-for-profit. We've been operating in Lesotho for the past 5 years, and our mission is to improve economic development through job creation, and we do that through skills development through in local fellowship that runs for 10 months, where we recruit recent graduates in the built environment to work on a design and build project we learn by doing. Please do follow us on all our social media pages on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and on TikTok recently. And please do fill in the survey that my colleague Daniela Guzman has just put in the chat box for us to find out what type of conversations you'd like to have. Please do enjoy the rest of your day and have a Rise-filled week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.